One of the next texts that we're coming to as we study through 1 Corinthians is chapter 12. And in chapter 12, Paul transitions this conversation from communion and head coverings to spiritual things or issues related to the Spirit. It is the Greek word pneumatikon, and it means generally, or issues, things related to the Spirit. It could be gifts of the Spirit as well. Just in context, you could add the idea of gifts to it. Best way to translate is spiritual things or spiritual issues. So what Paul's saying is, I don't want you to be ignorant as he begins chapter 12. I don't want you to be ignorant or lack information or lack knowledge about issues related to the Spirit when you gather together. I do think it is the context continuing from the previous chapter and then moving into this chapter around the gathering. All of 1 Corinthians in many ways is about learning to gather well, especially starting in chapter 8. What we're going to see both introduced to us in these verses and then going forward throughout the book, the next couple chapters of the book of 1 Corinthians until the end of 14, is when you gather and the Holy Spirit is going to show up when you gather. Like there's an assumption, an expectation that the Holy Spirit's going to be there when you gather, and he's not going to show up in one person that's standing up and preaching a sermon. He's not going to show up in one person that's standing up and holding a guitar and playing. He is going to show up and speak through many people in the gathering. That's what we're going to see in the next few chapters, which, by the way, does speak to a church gathering being the kind of experience where not one person is leading or one person is speaking or one person is teaching, but that the church is teaching each other. Just like it says in Romans, I think it's Romans chapter 13, that everybody should come to the gathering prepared to teach each other. And this text and the next few chapters are going to show us that is what we should expect the Spirit to do in us and through us, is that when we gather, the Spirit should speak. Paul goes on to say that you know, here's something you do know. I don't want you to lack knowledge, but here's something you do know, that you were led by idols who do not speak before, and by being led by them, you were led astray or you're led in error. And what Paul's doing is he's painting a picture of them being led by an idol who can't even talk. And that's going to be important because in a minute he's going to talk about how the Spirit does speak to us. If we remember 1 Corinthians well, remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he starts out his entire letter by showing what maturity is. Maturity is learning to listen to the Spirit speak to our spirit about the things freely given to us of God, or the things of God, so that we have the mind of Christ, or what might be a better way to understand it is the thoughts of Christ intermingling and dominating our thoughts. That's how Paul defines spiritual maturity in the gospel, as us learning to listen to the Spirit or have the thoughts of the Spirit of Christ in our thoughts, dominating our thoughts. Here, Paul says, you have been being led by, directed by idols who can't even talk. And then he's going to, in this next couple of clauses, he's going to describe a contrast between what does it look like when someone says something that is from the Spirit and someone who says something that's not from the Spirit. And when he does that, he's teaching us that as the Spirit talks to us, his words needs to be evaluated. His words need to be evaluated. That is true in the gathering. When we are together and we are hearing someone speak, we need to evaluate whether their words are from the Holy Spirit or not. And in our own heart and in our own mind, we need to evaluate the words, the thoughts that we believe are from the Spirit against the truth that the Bible teaches about Jesus. Here's how Paul says that. He says, here's what I want you to know. No one, when they're speaking, and this is a Greek present participle, which means a present tense continual verb, when they're continually speaking in the Spirit, would ever say Jesus is anathema. The word anathema can mean a lot of different things. One of the things it can mean is just cut off them from the community or banned from the community. That is what we most often hear it used, in the way we most often hear it used. But another way it can be used is in both the Septuagint and Greek literature. It was often used in a more simple way, which is to set up something. And it began to take on the context of being set up, something to be set up for worship. In Greek context, often that was an idol or an offering being set up for worship. In Jewish context, in the Hebrew Bible in context, often it was a positive thing, something to be set aside for worship, is how the Septuagint would have used this word. I believe in context because of all the picture that we've been painting of idols and the idol worship going on around the Corinthian church, and even in this text, just a verse before this, a reference to them following idols. I believe the best way to understand anathema in this text is another idol. So what the Spirit is not going to lead someone to say is that Jesus is just another idol or just another one of your deities. It could be implied here that what the Corinthians were dealing with, what they were fighting with, is a temptation or an error in thinking and belief that yes, Jesus is to be worshiped. Yes, Jesus is going to be our God. He's going to be one of our gods. He's going to be added to our collection. We're going to have a sun god and a rain god and a dream god and all kinds of different deities that we worship, and Jesus is going to be just another one of those gods. I think that is relevant too in some religious cultures where we have saints that we look to for support in lots of different categories of life: a saint of dreams, a saint of agriculture, a saint of war, etc. And when we start to look to those sources as our source of hope or strength or salvation in those areas of life, we're doing something very similar to what Paul says we shouldn't do. And we are not remembering that Jesus is the only one who is our hope. We are listening to a word that is not from the Spirit. We're listening to a message that is not from the Spirit. So Paul says that when the message is that Jesus is just another God, that is a message that is not from the Spirit. And then he ends his paragraph by saying, finally, also, on the other hand, no one has the ability to say that Jesus is Lord unless it is in or by the Holy Spirit speaking to him and speaking through him. So Paul ends by giving a contrast to his previous statement where he said that anyone who does say that Jesus is just another God is not speaking by the Spirit. But then he says, someone can't say a true thing about Jesus unless it is given to them by the Spirit. Whether that's a believer or non-believer, no one will ever say a true word about Jesus unless they're speaking in and through and by the Holy Spirit. We know that in the Gospels, there are those who speak, who aren't believers, who speak out of the Spirit, even though they're not aware of it. And so someone who speaks the truth about Jesus is speaking by the leading of the Holy Spirit. In this case, Jesus is Lord, which could be, it is Jesus Kyrios, it could be Master or King, but I believe in context, it is more referring to the sacred name of God in this case, that Jesus is Yahweh, Jesus is Jehovah. He is the one true God. He's not just another idol. He's not just another God. He is the God that we see demonstrated in the Old Testament. He's the Creator. He's the Almighty One. He does not lack any power, any knowledge, any wisdom. He is perfectly, infinitely good, kind, wise, just, righteous. He is the one true God. Jesus is as much God as the Father is God. And that idea about who Jesus is, a correct, full understanding of Jesus would only come through the Spirit. Could also be what Paul is saying in this text. In either way, as we walk through the text, the big takeaway I believe that Paul wants us to have from this is truth about Jesus always comes from the Spirit, and the Spirit will continually, obsessively teach us about who Jesus is. The Spirit will mediate to us the thoughts and the mind and the words and the heart of Jesus. So when the Spirit is speaking, he's going to speak as a representation of Jesus, a representative of Jesus, and he is going to speak about Jesus, and he's going to speak accurately in reflecting the character and quality of Jesus. So as you have a moment today, pause, get on your knees, and just listen to the Spirit talk to you about who Jesus is.